Welcome back to God's story and our sacred journey, Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In our last episode, we witnessed the miraculous birth of Jesus Christ. Now the star continues its journey, guiding the wise men closer to their destination. But what will they find when they arrive? And how will their gifts reveal the true purpose of this sacred child? Let's find out.
The night sky sprawled like a vast ink-black canvas above Bethlehem, studded with stars that flickered like ancient secrets whispered across eternity. Yet among them, one star burned fiercer, its light spilling over the desert like molten silver. This was no ordinary star. It stood apart, commanding attention as though imbued with a purpose that defied comprehension. Below it, the sands shimmered faintly in its glow, their gold hues muted by the night's cold grip. Beneath that enigmatic star, three figures traveled, their outlines painted against the dunes like fragile shadows in an immense and unforgiving world. Their robes, once vibrant, were now muted by the dust of a journey that had stretched into countless days and nights. Each step they took pressed into the reluctant sand, leaving behind imprints that spoke of a steadfast determination and weariness they refused to let claim them. Melchior, the eldest, bore the weight of years in the stoop of his shoulders, though his eyes burned with an unyielding fire. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the reins of his camel as if to tether himself to the earth beneath him. "That star?" he murmured, his voice rough like parchment rubbed too thin. "It's more than light. It's a calling, a sign that will not be ignored." Beside him, Balthazar adjusted his headdress against the evening breeze, his eyes scanning the heavens. The star's brilliance reflected in his gaze, making it seem as if his thoughts burned with it. "A beacon," he replied, his tone softer but no less resolute. "It promises something beyond us, something beyond even kings and their realms. We cannot falter now." The youngest, Caspar, walked ahead, his stride less encumbered by the wear of years but marked with the restless energy of a seeker. The star was reflected in his eyes, but unlike Balthazar's contemplative gaze, his held a childlike wonder, as though he feared, blinking, might extinguish its impossible radiance. "It feels alive," he whispered, more to himself than the others, "as though it watches us as we watch it." The desert itself seemed to listen. The sands stretched out in all directions, a barren and indifferent expanse, softened only by the rhythmic tread of camels and the occasional murmur of wind against dunes. But even in its silence, the landscape seemed changed under the star's light, no longer desolate, but pregnant with possibility, as though the land itself bore witness to the celestial event unfolding above it. As the star climbed higher into the heavens, its light seemed to pulse, illuminating not only the path ahead, but the faces of those who followed. Melchior's furrowed brow eased as the memory of ancient prophecies unfurled in his mind. Balthazar's lips moved in silent prayer, each word rising like incense toward the brilliance above. And Caspar, the dreamer, smiled faintly, his heart stirred by something he could not name, a yearning that pulled at his soul as the star pulled them forward. This was no ordinary journey, and the men knew it. Each carried within him a story, a reason for stepping into the unknown. Yet in this moment, their individual tales converged into one, a shared belief that the star, this guiding light, would lead them not just to a place, but to an understanding, a revelation that would change the very course of history. And so they pressed on, their figures fading into the vastness of the desert as the star shone brighter still, an eternal promise etched into the night. The star was not just a light. It was an anchor, a silent herald that spoke in brilliance where words would fail. Its beams stretched like outstretched arms, reaching to touch hearts that yearned for truth. Beneath its gaze, the world seemed both infinitely vast and intimately close, as though every grain of sand, every gust of wind, carried whispers of a story waiting to unfold. Its radiance pierced the velvet of the night, casting the desert into an ethereal play of shadows and silver. The three travelers, silhouetted by its glow, moved like phantoms in a dream. Each step they took reverberated with purpose, their journey a testimony to a faith that transcended understanding. Melchior, his face lined with years of wisdom, turned his eyes heavenward. "This star," he began, his voice low and steady, "it carries more than light. It carries a promise, a hope greater than kings or empires." The words hung in the air, as if even the night paused to listen. Balthazar, ever contemplative, let his gaze linger on the celestial flame. "A sign," he murmured, almost reverent, "a guide for those who dare to seek beyond what they know." He adjusted the folds of his robe, his movements deliberate, as though to mirror the star's unerring resolve. Caspar, the youngest, stood apart, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of wonder. "As though it sees us, as though it knows why we follow." The star did not answer in words, but its light grew warmer, stronger, as if urging them forward. It was a beacon of both destination and destiny, its brilliance cutting through the uncertainty of the world below. The travelers felt its pull not just in their eyes but in their souls, an invitation to step into a story greater than themselves. Far off, the world slept, unaware of the light or its significance, the villagers nestled in the valleys, the shepherds tending their flocks, the merchants resting beside their caravans, all of them were blind to the star's silent declaration. Yet for these three, the world had shifted, its axis now aligned with the path carved by that single, unwavering light. "This star," Melchior said again, more to himself this time, "it is more than a guide. It is a question, a challenge. Will we follow, not knowing where it leads?" Balthazar placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Not knowing is the essence of faith," he replied, "and faith is why we walk." Caspar, trailing behind them, closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the light even then, pressing against his closed lids, as if to say, "Open your heart, and you will see more than the sky." And so they continued, the star drawing them onward, its light not only illuminating their path, but igniting a quiet flame within them. It was more than a light. It was the promise of something eternal, something divine, calling out across the expanse of heaven and earth. The desert stretched endlessly before them, its golden expanse shimmering beneath the relentless sun by day and falling into an icy stillness by night. Each grain of sand seemed to shift restlessly, as though whispering tales of those who had dared to cross its vast emptiness before. It was a place of contradictions, both beautiful and harsh, a landscape that demanded endurance and rewarded only the most steadfast. The caravan moved slowly, each step a struggle against the shifting ground that offered no purchase, no relief. The camels groaned under their burdens, their long legs cutting deliberate paths through the dunes. Above them, the sky was a dome of unforgiving blue, broken only by the faint, unwavering brilliance of the star that guided them. Its light, faint in the day, was a promise they clung to as fiercely as they clung to the reins in their hands. Melchior rode at the front, his back hunched slightly against the wind that carried stinging particles of sand into their faces. His robes, once vibrant, were now faded, their edges worn from the unrelenting elements. Yet his eyes, sharp and weathered, remained fixed on the horizon. "This is no ordinary journey," he muttered, half to himself, half to the others. "The star leads us for a reason." Balthazar followed close behind, his expression one of quiet determination. The desert had tested him in ways he had not anticipated, the searing heat that drained strength from his body, the chilling nights that gnawed at his bones. Yet he bore it all with a calm resolve, his thoughts fixed on the prophecy that had brought them together. "The path of faith is never easy," he said, his voice steady, "but we walk it not for ease, but for purpose." Caspar, the youngest of the three, struggled to keep his footing as his camel stumbled on the loose sand. His face was streaked with sweat and grit, his lips dry and cracked, but his eyes shone with a fervent light. "The star has not wavered," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, "and neither will we." The days blurred into nights, the sun dipping below the dunes in a cascade of gold and crimson before surrendering to the deep, velvet blue of the desert sky. At night, the star blazed brighter, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The travelers found solace in its presence, their spirits buoyed by the thought that each step brought them closer to their destination. The desert, however, was not without its challenges. A sudden sandstorm erupted one afternoon, the wind howling like a feral beast as it whipped sand into the air, blinding them and forcing them to halt. The camels huddled together, their bodies a shield against the storm, as the men wrapped their robes tightly around themselves, bracing against the fury of the elements. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world eerily quiet in its wake, the three men emerged from their shelter, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes filled with renewed determination. Melchior looked to the star which had reappeared in the clearing skies, its light undiminished. "It remains," he said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "Even through the storm, it remains." Balthazar placed a reassuring hand on Caspar's shoulder. "And so do we," he said simply. The journey continued, the desert shifting around them like a living thing. Each step was a testament to their resolve, each mile a chapter in a story that was still unfolding. They pressed on, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts guided by the star that would not let them falter. The desert seemed eternal, an endless sea of sand that swallowed the horizon and stretched into the unknowable distance. Yet, amidst its vastness, a quiet determination burned within the hearts of the travelers. The star above, unyielding in its brilliance, served as a constant reminder of their purpose, a light that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of relentless hardship. Melchior, his face weathered by both time and the elements, sat silently atop his camel, his eyes fixed on the heavens. "It is not by chance we follow this star," he said, breaking the stillness of the night. "It is a call, a command. Faith does not waver, even when the body tires." For Balthazar, riding beside him, nodded, his expression one of quiet contemplation. "Faith," he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "It is what carries us forward, even when the path grows dim. It is what gives meaning to every step, every struggle." Caspar, trailing slightly behind, listened intently to their words, his young face lit by the pale glow of the star. "And yet," he said, his voice filled with wonder, "it feels as though the star carries us, as though it knows the burdens we bear and refuses to let us fall." The nights were their reprieve, the desert's merciless heat replaced by a biting chill that made their breath visible in the air. Around a small fire, they shared what little provisions they had, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. Despite their exhaustion, there was a quiet camaraderie, a shared understanding that bound them as tightly as the journey itself. "It is not just a child we seek," Melchior said, his voice steady. "It is a promise, a hope that transcends kings and kingdoms. The star leads us to something greater than ourselves." Balthazar added, "And it is not an easy path. But what path worth taking ever is?" Caspar, gazing into the fire, felt the weight of their words. He thought of the miles they had traveled, the storms they had braved, the endless nights spent beneath the vast expanse of stars. And yet the light of the star above had never faltered, its glow a silent encouragement that urged them forward. When they walked, the silence of the desert enveloped them, broken only by the soft crunch of sand beneath their feet and the occasional groan of their camels. The rhythm of their steps became a meditation, their breaths a prayer. The star remained their guide, its light unwavering, its message clear: keep going, do not falter, the journey is not in vain. One evening, as they paused to rest, Caspar spoke, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "This star," he said, "is more than light. It is faith itself, made visible. It carries us as much as we follow it." Melchior smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with something unspoken. "Then let us honor it," he said, "by walking, by believing, by enduring." And so they rose again, the sand shifting beneath their feet, the star watching over them as they moved forward. The desert with all its trials was no match for the light that guided them, nor for the faith that burned within them. They pressed on, their journey a testament to the unyielding power of belief. Jerusalem rose before them like a vision out of the haze, its stone walls gleaming faintly in the morning light, cradled by the surrounding hills. The city, alive with the hum of human activity, seemed a world apart from the quiet expanse of the desert they had left behind. Merchants lined the gates with their wares, their voices blending into a symphony of bartering and calls. The air was thick with the scent of spices, baked bread, and the faint tang of sweat from the masses. Melchior, leading the small caravan, paused at the crest of a hill, his keen eyes scanning the bustling streets below. "This is the place," he said, his voice measured but laced with the weariness of their long journey. "Here we find the answers the star has promised." Balthazar adjusted his robes, the fabric heavy with the dust of countless miles. His gaze lingered on the gates, where soldiers stood at their posts, their faces etched with disinterest. "A city of kings," he murmured, "but will it know the king we seek?" Caspar, the youngest, leaned forward on his camel, his face alight with anticipation. "It must," he said with the conviction of youth. "The star has brought us here for a reason. Someone will know where to find him." The three dismounted at the city's edge, their camels groaning softly in relief. The streets were narrower than they had expected, alive with the shuffling of feet and the creak of wooden carts. They moved together, their robes brushing against one another, a single determined force against the chaos of the marketplace. Eyes turned to them with curious glances, some tinged with suspicion, others with open fascination. Foreigners, their attire and manner marking them as men of distinction, yet strangers nonetheless. "Excuse me?" Melchior addressed a passing vendor, his tone both respectful and firm. "We seek a child. A king, newly born. Have you heard of such news?" The vendor, a woman with a sharp gaze, paused in her work of arranging dates in neat piles. "A king?" she echoed, her tone laced with skepticism. "You'll want the palace then, stranger. If a king has been born, surely Herod will know." Her words hung heavy in the air, a thread of unease weaving through them. Balthazar glanced at his companions, his brow furrowing slightly. "Herod," he said softly, the name carrying weight. "If this city bows to any man, it is to him." Caspar, undeterred, stepped forward. "Then we will go to him," he said. "The star has led us here. It cannot be wrong." And so they made their way toward the heart of the city, where Herod's palace loomed, an imposing structure of stone and power. The streets seemed to grow quieter as they approached, the vibrancy of the market giving way to a solemn, almost oppressive air. The star above them still shone, its light faint against the brightness of day, but no less present, a silent guide as unwavering as their purpose. They would face Herod, they would ask their questions, and they would hold to the truth the star had promised them, whatever lay ahead. Their journey had brought them here for a reason, and they would see it through. The palace loomed before them, a fortress of polished stone that seemed to glimmer faintly under the fading light of day. Its walls, tall and unyielding, bore the weight of history and power, their edges softened only by the breeze that whispered through the olive trees lining the courtyard. Here, in this place of grandeur, the three travelers paused, their steps slowing as though they carried the burden of what lay ahead. The guards at the gates regarded them with suspicion, their hands resting on the hilts of swords that glinted in the twilight, yet there was no mistaking the air of authority that cloaked these men. Foreign though they were, their bearing and their purpose were unmistakable. With a nod from their leader Melchior, the gates creaked open, allowing them entry into the court of King Herod. Inside, the air was thick with incense and ambition. The great hall stretched before them, its floors an intricate mosaic of color that seemed almost too vivid in the dim light of flickering torches. Herod sat at the far end, his throne an ornate display of power, the man upon it draped in silks and shadow. His eyes, dark and piercing, studied the visitors as they approached, his expression a careful mask of curiosity. Melchior stepped forward, his voice calm and unwavering despite the intensity of the king's gaze. "We have come," he began, each word deliberate, "following a star that has guided us across many lands. It has brought us here to seek a child, a king newly born. Do you know where we might find him?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Herod leaned back in his throne, his fingers steepled as he regarded them with an inscrutable expression. "A king, you say?" he replied, his tone measured, almost disbelieving. "Yet here I sit, and I have heard no such news." Balthazar, ever perceptive, caught the subtle edge in Herod's voice, a mixture of feigned ignorance and something darker, a shadow that flickered behind his words. Still, he pressed on. "The star does not lie," he said. "It speaks of a prophecy fulfilled, of a ruler who will shepherd his people. We are certain he is near." Herod's lips curved into a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "How intriguing," he said, his voice smooth. "A child, you say? A king? Perhaps my scribes and priests can assist you in your search. They are well versed in the ancient texts." Caspar, the youngest, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Herod's words were gracious, but his presence was heavy with something unspoken, a tension that seemed to seep into the very air of the hall. Yet he stood firm, his gaze unflinching as he met the king's eyes. "Go then," Herod continued, his tone almost magnanimous. "Seek this child, and when you have found him, return to me. Tell me where he is, so that I too may go and worship him." The words hung in the air, hollow and perfumed with deceit. The travelers exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They bowed, their movements respectful but measured, and turned to leave. As they stepped out into the night, the palace gates closing behind them, the star reappeared in the sky above, its light steady and unwavering. Melchior exhaled slowly, his expression grim. "He does not seek to worship," he said quietly. "He seeks to destroy." Balthazar nodded, his gaze fixed on the heavens. "The star will guide us. We must trust it, and not him." And so they pressed on, the brilliance of the star lighting their path once more, a promise of hope against the gathering shadows. The star hung low in the sky now, its light no longer a distant guide, but an intimate presence, as though it leaned closer to whisper its secrets to the earth below. The landscape had shifted, the vast, unyielding desert giving way to hills dotted with shrubs and occasional olive trees. The air was softer here, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and life, a promise of something sacred waiting just beyond the horizon. Melchior was the first to notice the change. "Look," he said, pointing skyward, his voice trembling with an awe he could not contain. "The star! It slows. It beckons us not to a place far ahead, but to something near." Balthazar and Caspar followed his gaze, their faces illuminated by the star's glow. It was no longer the distant, untouchable light that had guided them across deserts and through storms. Now it seemed almost within reach, as though it sought to embrace them, to draw them toward a truth that could not be ignored. Their steps quickened, the weariness of their journey momentarily forgotten. The star led them through a narrow path between two hills, its light illuminating each stone and shrub as if to say, "This is the way." The camels, usually slow and deliberate, seemed to sense the urgency and followed without hesitation, their burdens lighter, as though the star itself lifted the weight from their backs. They came to a clearing, and there the star stopped. Its light, so constant and unchanging, seemed to pulse now, a gentle rhythm that matched the beating of their hearts. Before them stood a small house, humble in its simplicity, its walls made of stone and its roof of thatch. It was a place unremarkable by any earthly standard, and yet, under the star's light, it became something extraordinary. Caspar was the first to dismount, his movements almost reverent, as his feet touched the ground. "Here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is where it leads." Melchior and Balthazar followed, their gazes fixed on the house. There were no banners, no guards, no signs of royalty as the world understood it. And yet, they felt it in their very souls. They had arrived at the threshold of something divine. "These stars stops here," Melchior said, his voice thick with emotion. "It has carried us across lands and through trials, and now it rests. This is the place." Balthazar nodded, his hand resting on the neck of his camel as if to steady himself. "The light does not lie," he said. "We are where we are meant to be." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the journey and the significance of this moment settling over them like a mantle. The star, its purpose fulfilled, shone brighter than ever, casting its light not just on the house, but on the hearts of those who stood before it. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. This was not the end of their journey, but the culmination of its purpose. With steady steps, they moved forward, their shadows stretching behind them as they approached the house where the light had led them. The star, ever faithful, watched over them, its glow a testament to the power of belief and the fulfillment of a promise whispered across the heavens. The air inside the humble dwelling was heavy with a quiet reverence, as though the walls themselves understood the sacredness of the moment. The three travelers stepped inside, their robes brushing against the doorway, their movements slow and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of the journey they had undertaken. Before them was the child, cradled in his mother's arms. The room was simple, no tapestries, no gilded furniture, only straw scattered across the floor and a wooden manger that bore the marks of time and use. And yet, there was a light here, a presence that transcended the modest surroundings. It was not the light of the star, though its glow still spilled gently through the cracks in the roof. This light came from within, a radiance that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the child. Melchior was the first to kneel, his old bones creaking as he lowered himself to the ground. He placed a small, intricately carved chest before the child. "Gold," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "A gift for a king, for you, who will reign with wisdom and justice." Balthazar stepped forward next, his dark eyes glistening as he laid a jar of fragrant resin at the child's feet. "Frankincense," he said, his voice steady but thick with reverence. "A gift for the priest, for you who will bridge heaven and earth." Caspar, the youngest, approached last. His hands shook as he offered a small vial, its contents dark and mysterious. "One," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the child. "A gift for sacrifice, for you who will bear the weight of the world." Mary, her face serene, but touched with wonder, accepted their gifts with a nod of gratitude. She held the child close, her eyes reflecting both the profound joy and quiet sorrow of a mother who understood the enormity of what lay ahead. The travelers remained kneeling, their heads bowed, not in submission to a king of armies or wealth, but to a king of hope and redemption. In that moment, they were not scholars or rulers or seekers. They were simply men who had found what their hearts had long sought. Outside, the star's light grew softer, as if it too bowed before the child. The camels, restless from the journey, stood still, their large eyes reflecting the glow that seeped from the cracks of the humble home. Even the wind seemed to pause, its breath a quiet hymn that carried the scent of frankincense and the promise of something eternal. As they rose, their hearts heavy yet full, they knew their journey had not ended, but had transformed. The gifts they brought were small compared to the gifts they had received, a glimpse of divinity, a reminder that even in the smallest, humblest places, the greatest truths could be found. Melchior turned to his companions, his voice barely a whisper. "We came seeking a king," he said, "and we have found so much more." Balthazar nodded, his gaze lingering on the child. "The world will not understand him," he said, "but we have seen. We will carry this light with us, wherever we go." "Who?" Caspar, his youthful face etched with something older now, looked to the star one last time. "It led us here," he said, "and it will lead others. This is just the beginning. And so they stepped back into the night, the stars' light guiding their steps once more. But they carried within them a new light, one that no desert, no storm, no darkness could ever extinguish. The fire crackled softly in the chill of the evening, its embers glowing like miniature stars scattered across the dark earth. The old shepherd sat close to the flames, his rough hands outstretched toward the warmth, their calloused surfaces telling the story of a lifetime spent in the fields. His face, lined with age and weathered by countless seasons, bore the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen much and spoken little. Around him the night stretched vast and still, broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse grass. Above, the heavens sparkled with a million tiny lights, but it was the one star, the one brighter and bolder than all the rest, that seemed to hold his gaze. "That star," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, as though it carried the weight of the earth itself. "It has brought men across deserts and mountains. It has led kings to their knees, and yet it is not just for them." The shepherd leaned forward, his silhouette framed by the firelight. His eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with understanding, scanned the faces of those gathered around him. "It is for all of us," he continued, his tone firm but gentle, "for the mighty and the meek, for the wise and the wandering. That light calls to anyone who dares to lift their eyes and follow." He reached for a small branch, poking at the fire until the flames danced higher, casting flickering shadows against the rocky hillside. "I have spent my life watching the stars," he said, "guiding my flock by their light, finding my way in the darkest of nights, but never have I seen a star like this one. It is as though it carries a voice, a song sung not with words, but with light." The others listened in silence, their own gazes lifting toward the brilliant star that seemed to hover above them, unwavering and eternal. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the air, and the shepherd smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. "It is not the star itself that matters," he said, almost to himself. "It is what it points to. It is the journey it inspires, the hope it ignites." He paused, letting the silence settle around them like a blanket. Then, his voice softened, becoming almost a whisper. "We are all wanderers," he said, "each of us searching for something, though we may not always know what it is. That star, it reminds us that we are not alone in our search, that there is something greater, something worth finding." As he fell quiet, the night seemed to breathe around them, the vast expanse of sky pressing close in its stillness. The shepherd's words lingered, carried on the wind, sinking deep into the hearts of those who had heard them. He leaned back against a worn rock, his eyes returning to the star one last time. "Let it guide you," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Let it lead you, as it has led so many, and when you reach where it points, may you find not just what you are searching for, but what you never knew you needed." The flames burned lower as the night wore on, but the star above remained, steady and bright, a promise etched into the fabric of the universe.
Thank you for being a part of today's episode. If this story inspired you, please share it with your friends and leave your thoughts below. In our next episode, we'll follow the wise men as they present their gifts and experience the joy of worshiping the newborn king. Subscribe to God's Story and enable notifications to stay with us on this sacred journey. See you next time.